welcome to the last episode of Season 3 of the Equip Project podcast. Jim, it's going to be strange not having our weekly recording sessions over the summer months. Have you any plans for summer?
Well, my most pressing plan is to find someone who'll give me a haircut. Not a particularly grand plan for the future. I think I may need to recalibrate my levels of ambition. I'm embarrassed to admit that I don't actually have any real concrete plans for the summer. Hopefully it'll be more sociable. I've actually met up with friends in the past 2 days, which in relative terms is a riotous round of social engagements. I mean, it was all perfectly legal. We sat outside Daft Eddie's on Strangford Lough and huddled in overcoats in between the snow showers. But it did give me a taste once again for actual human contact.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was so great to be back at church physically on Easter Sunday. It was a real, I felt there was a real sense of people being less anxious than previously as well. The atmosphere was really wonderful and just reinforced how much we've missed being together in the same physical space over the past while.
Yeah, I was worried that you were going to talk about Good Friday rather than Easter Sunday. I should explain to everyone, I persuaded poor Ollie to help me record the longest sermon I have ever preached. And we did it after our Good Friday service because all the technical kit had been set up.
Yeah, that was a pretty lengthy sermon, I have to say. It was 2 hours, just over 2 hours long, and it happened to coincide with some of the riots that were taking place in Sandy Road, just down the road from us. So as you were speaking, I was hearing just constant sirens and then like fireworks and shouting. I thought someone was marching on us, Jim.
Well, it was a controversial subject, although I suspected the youths hurling petrol bombs at the place and I weren't really defending the doctrine of unconditional election. Maybe they were, who knows? I mean, Northern Irish politics is a complicated affair. Anyway, we got through it in one piece. But, you're right about Sunday, Ollie. It was absolutely lovely just to be back out at church again. And hopefully the Christian community in Ireland will be able to regain its weekly rhythms of worship and learning and serving once again.
Yeah, I was looking over or thinking back over some of the topics we've covered this season, Jim, and we've tackled some really significant, weighty issues. And the general theme of this season has been the elements that make up society. So we've talked about things like the media. We've talked about cultural artifacts like language and history. We talked about new social forces like Islam. We also talked about some of the controlling narratives in our culture. So big stories of expressive individualism and critical theory. And then last week, we touched on the prophetic voice of the church in the public square and our responsibility to call people to repentance and how our society is attempting to cut off that prophetic voice. In this, which is going to be the last episode of Season 3, I want to turn our attention to the role of education in society. I think this is such a significant topic. I didn't just mean institutions like universities and schools, but also let's think more generally about how young people develop and train their minds in this society. Education has unfortunately moved center stage in the various culture wars that rage in society just now. Christian parents are worried that schools are becoming hostile to Christianity. And there's an increasing concern about indoctrination, even of children of a very young age. As well as that, there's this cancel culture in universities, which creates essentially a climate of fear for anyone who doesn't conform to ideologies that are viewed as fashionable or kind of on trend during this period of culture.
Yeah, it is. It's a hugely important topic, but I think it's important to say up front, Ollie, that we won't be attempting to adjudicate between various theories of education. That would take us, certainly take me too far outside my sphere of competence. I mean, everything I know about John Dewey's educational theories could be written on the back of a postage stamp. So our main interest really is going to be in the challenges that our public education system presents to young Christians. And once we understand those challenges, we'll then be able to discuss how education in the home and in church can best complement and correct the deficiencies found in school and university.
Yeah, and I guess the other preliminary point is that in this conversation, we won't tackle the idea of homeschooling or so-called Christian colleges, Both those ideas are very common in the US, but they're still pretty rare in Europe. And at the moment, we're blessed in Northern Ireland in particular to have a school system that is saturated by Christian school teachers. So in this conversation, we're going to assume a model in which the bulk of education is delivered by the state, but where any deficiencies in the state education system are overcome by education in the church as well as in the family home.
Yeah, there may come a time in the future where homeschooling might become much more of a live option, but I, for one, don't know enough about it to have anything useful to say.
Yeah, I think that's it's probably best we steer clear of that for now. But let's kick things off here, Jim. In a few moments, I want to work down the educational age range. So we'll start off thinking about universities, then secondary schools, and then finally primary schools. Once we've identified the challenges in each sector, we'll be in a position to see how the church and family education can then meet those challenges. But before we get to that part of the conversation, I just want to think a little bit more, generally, a little bit more broadly about the value of education. How should Christians think about education?
My mother was a very intelligent woman who was forced to leave school at the age of 14. She'd actually won a scholarship to what was the best school in Belfast at that time, but her mother placed the award letter in the fire when she learned that she would have to pay for a school uniform. And my father had a similar experience. So when my mum and dad got married, they were determined to make sure that their children got a good education. And the thing I really admire about my parents is that they didn't give a rap about social status, so we were never encouraged to choose careers that might impress other people. Both of them were driven by, well, an insatiable curiosity, really. A desire to learn things. We used to have a little summer house down in Annalong at the foot of the Mourne Mountains. And I remember once my mum came across this species of plant that grew in the marshes. And it's a thing called a sundew, and it's a carnivorous plant. So it traps little insects using a sticky substance on the tentacles of its leaves. And I'll never forget Mum spending hours staring down a little microscope that she had bought to look at these sundew plants. She was feeding them bits of sausage to see how they digested their food. And Dad was even more incorrigible. He spent his Saturdays trawling through second-hand bookstores. So, our house was packed full of books, so much so that Mum forbade Dad from buying more books. So he used to come home with maybe, 10 books, and he would leave 9 of them outside the front door and then walk in the rear door of the house holding a single book with an apologetic look on his face. And then, when Mum was distracted, he would smuggle the other 9 in. Now, the point of that nostalgic story is that education isn't the same thing as training for a vocation. I think God expects us to be curious about the world he has created. He wants us to explore it and cultivate it, to think deeply about it. So we should love to learn things, learn about architecture and literature and physics and botany and history. Not because we can leverage that knowledge for commercial gain or social status, but just for the sheer fun of learning stuff. I listened to a conversation between Michael Knowles and Douglas Murray recently, and they were talking about King Lear, the Shakespeare play. And I was filled with this really profound regret that I knew so little about literature. So I could only vaguely follow the conversation. The truth is, Ollie, I completely wasted my time at school and university. I was incorrigibly lazy. So let the regrets of an older man stir the ambition of younger people. Seize every opportunity to learn. Never stop being curious. Learn to love ideas and narratives and hoover up knowledge just for the sheer fun of it. There is a strand of thought within the Christian church which argues that the only career worth anything is full-time Christian ministry. We're told that every other way of serving God is for second-class citizens. The job of those Christians is just to make money, the money needed to fund full-time Christian ministers. Now, I cannot find the words to describe how wrong that view of life is. I don't quite know how God will transmute this old world into the new heavens and earth that we read about in Revelation. But nothing good will get lost. So Christians should design the most beautiful bridges, the most elegant software algorithms, craft the wisest laws, create the most beautiful piece of carpentry. Just look at the intricacy, the beauty of creation, and realize that God is no utilitarian. So I guess what I'm really trying to say here, Ollie, is that education isn't a means to an end. It's best understood as a creature delighting in exploring the Creator's world.
Yeah, I love those thoughts, Jim. And I also love to think of our creativity and learning bringing joy to the Lord, who built that very potential into us. I think that when you're taken up with that mindset, it's really transformative. So education enables us to cultivate the skills that are required for us to make an impact on the world. We need skills to study, to communicate, to speak, to write, and to research, and also to solve problems. Isn't that right?
That's very true. And maybe the most important skill of them all is what we might call critical thinking. That's the ability to think logically, to reason, to analyze, to recognize bias. In many ways, the ability to think critically is the foundation on which every other mental discipline is built. So think of the thing the Bible calls wisdom. We might loosely describe that as the art of living. That relies heavily on the ability to think critically. I mean, how else can we make sound judgments about life's values and goals?
I just want to read from Luke's Gospel, chapter 2 and verse 52. And it says this, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man." I think that's a really striking verse, isn't it? Because it shows us that even the Lord Jesus learned, and he is our example to follow in that regard. I think that's really, really striking. Let's change gears now and think a little bit more practically about universities, secondary schools, and primary schools. At each educational stage, there's various challenges that lie ahead for young Christians. So let's start with universities and sort of work our way down. What are the big challenges or the big educational issues faced by Christians on university campuses?
Well, universities are under pressure from lots of directions at the moment. For starters, these days everything is so specialized that knowledge has become compartmentalized and even fragmented. So very few people can see the big picture. You know, even within a single academic discipline, there are so many specialist fields that, if you like, nobody is steering the car. Everybody has their heads down solving one tiny piece of the jigsaw. How many mixed metaphors can I put here? But now that matters to the Christian because instinctively we always think about the big picture. We always want to pan the camera back and ask the big questions. But universities aren't terribly interested in those sorts of questions anymore. It's really interesting. Everything seems to have got very detailed and pragmatic. So that's one challenge. Commercialization is another threat. I mean, a century ago, a researcher would ask their supervisor if they could do research in a particular area. If it seemed like a fruitful contribution to human knowledge, the supervisor would say yes. But nowadays, the supervisor will mainly be interested in how much grant money the research will attract. Show me the money isn't exactly the most noble way to drive back the frontiers of knowledge. Lecturers complain that commercialization has even altered the relationship they have with undergraduate students. So the teacher-pupil relationship has morphed into the service provider-customer model. And in fact, the whole notion of a university degree has been reduced to a vocational qualification. So that's another challenge. I suppose the biggest one for the Christian is what we have talked about in the past. It's the so-called cancel culture. Universities used to be a marketplace of ideas. Nothing was off limits. Every and any idea or belief got scrutinized and critiqued. But in a society that demands safe spaces, there is less and less critical thinking done anymore on campus. Non-conformists are no longer welcome. We're told that debate triggers too much anxiety, so students are encouraged to recite the mantras of the most fashionable ideas. So I guess I could summarize the challenge of university life by describing it as an environment which is hostile to critical thinking about the big issues of life.
That's a really good summary, Jim. I just wanted to pick up on your point regarding universities as a marketplace of ideas. From my experience studying in both London and in Belfast, we were encouraged to write essays that made well-reasoned arguments. We were encouraged to have a perspective or to make a case for something. But what was clear was there was only a limited number of perspectives that were deemed acceptable. And so the marketplace of ideas was actually a very limited one. It was clear that certain ideas were essentially out of bounds, particularly ideas that weren't deemed progressive. And this meant that most of the arguments made by students were essentially just variations on the same theme. And this concerns me greatly, to be honest, because such a limited marketplace of ideas produces a generation of students who think and argue in very much the same way. There isn't enough diversity of opinion, and there aren't enough students who are willing and academically capable of challenging the accepted narratives of society. One of the most dramatic changes in our society relates to secondary schooling, and I want to touch on that now. Until very recently, secondary school education wasn't particularly controversial. Christian parents were told to prepare their kids for the dangers of university life. The big challenge to young Christians' faith came at the age of 18. But that's really changed in the last 10 years. The big challenges to Christianity are now faced by 14-year-olds, not 18-year-olds. How would you describe the educational challenges faced in secondary schools, Jim?
Well, let me make a general point about life in secondary schools first, and then we'll think about the more specific educational challenges, okay? I mean, it seems to me that I have two siblings who were teachers, so it seems to me that secondary schools have had to deal with the collapse of the family structure in society, and also the collapse in mental well-being amongst teenagers. So schools are now as much therapeutic centres as they are educational institutions nowadays. I mean, I'm obviously painting with a broad brush here, but in my school days, a teacher stood in front of a group of reasonably obedient children from fairly stable homes and taught them mathematics. But today, a typical secondary school teacher seems to be embroiled in this endless stream of pastoral and social issues. So teachers trying to explain something like maths to pupils who are much more fragile, self-absorbed, mixed up. Now, I appreciate that as a crude caricature of the situation, but I think it does contain a kernel of truth.
And what about the core educational challenges of secondary schooling?
Sure, I can think of three main ones. I think secularism, and then the authority problem, and what I'm going to call self-centered learning. A revolution occurred in the American education system at the end of the 19th century with the rise of the public school system. And I don't think it unfair to say that this was the moment when a secular worldview anchored itself within the American educational system. I mean, we sort of assume today that education is essentially secular. I mean, there might be the occasional religious education class, but religion in schools is examined from the outside, as a purely social phenomenon. So the notion of a biblical worldview never even gets a hearing in secondary schools. And by that term, I mean, how would I describe it? An overarching framework that integrates the way we view life. So, I mean, imagine a history class where the biblical view of war is discussed. Imagine a literature class where the Christian view of life's meaning is used to critique a Shakespeare play. Imagine a biology class where the concept of an intelligently designed universe is taken seriously. Okay? So, the first challenge is that teens are being educated in a world that is built from the ground up using secular principles. The second challenge relates to authority. There was an article in the papers last week, I think it was, about a secondary school in West London, in Pimlico. And the headmaster had attempted to impose rules about school uniform and hairstyles. But the pupils held a protest. They said that wearing a uniform was racist. They waved Black Lives Matters placards and burned the Union flag while chanting, "We want change." They complained about the colonialism of the curriculum. And the astonishing thing is that they prevailed. The headmaster backed down completely. In fact, he gave a public statement saying that he admired the pupils hugely for being so attuned to injustice. Some of the teachers joined with the pupils and passed a vote of no confidence in the headmaster. Now remember, this was all triggered by an attempt to impose a policy on uniforms and hairstyles. I think what that will do to teenagers, the authority of the teacher has been lost. And the authority of reason has also been lost. So teens are being taught that success comes through protesting. Logical arguments always get trumped by lived experience. I feel this is so true, so everyone must conform to my truth. At the very heart of education is the idea of a trusted authority figure. Authority is one of the three ways we gain knowledge. The other two are reason and experience. But the authority source has been destroyed by so-called pupil power. So that was the second thing that struck me. The final challenge is a thing I'm not sure that what educationalists would call it, but I'm going to call it self-centered learning. Back in the 1970s and 80s when I was at school, I learned about the Battle of Waterloo. I actually happened to be obsessed by the Battle of Waterloo, but that's a separate issue. So I learned the date and the location of the battle and so forth. I was taught about the participants and why it was perhaps the most important battle in European history. It altered the course of the world. But today, when it comes to discussing the Battle of Waterloo, pupils are asked to imagine how it must have felt to be a soldier in the battle. You get the point. Instead of adopting the role of an observer, gathering data, analysing the significance of that data, the pupil is now centre stage. So that's what I mean by self-centred learning. It reminds me of the title of Spike Milligan's autobiography. He called it Adolf Hitler, My Part in His Downfall, which is such a brilliant satire of the narcissistic desire to place ourselves in the centre of everything, even history. Now, I appreciate that sounds like the whinge of a grumpy old man, but I promise its significance will become clear in a few minutes' time.
No, that's a really, really helpful analysis, Jim. And one of the benefits of this podcast so far is it's given me a couple of ideas for season 4. We'll definitely have one episode on King Lear, and we'll have another on the Battle of Waterloo. So that's really useful. You're giving me all sorts of ideas. Brilliant. Let's finish off this survey by thinking about primary schooling. What are the biggest challenges in this area, Jim?
Well, the problem here can be summed up in one word: indoctrination. There is a systematic attempt underway to undermine the natural, normal way of understanding family life and sexuality that all 4- and 5-year-olds share. Their innocence is being deliberately corrupted. So, think of drag queens visiting kindergartens to tell infant stories about transgender people. Or think of the flood of colouring-in books and little storybooks about gay couples and transgender children. In my view, this, along with abortion on demand, is the single greatest act of wickedness being propagated in our society. As Isaiah says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter.
Yeah, it's certainly chilling and disturbing. Let's put all these challenges together. We thought about an education system which is hostile to critical thinking about the big issues of life. We've thought about the challenges of secularism, the rebellion against authority, and self-centered learning. And we've identified the really horrible drive to indoctrinate the minds of infant children. So how should Christians respond to those challenges?
Well, as you said at the start of this conversation, we need to complement the state education system, overcome its deficiencies and correct its errors through education in the home and in church. Now, that deceptively simple statement is actually a lot more radical than you might think, because we don't really think of church as an educational centre. I mean, I have to school my facial features into a fixed smile when someone says to me, I just want a sermon that inspires me, that gives me a lift to face work on Monday morning. Bah! One of the main jobs of a church is to educate. Church members should see themselves as pupils who have to learn. And learning isn't always fun and exciting. I mean, I remember as a child having to practice the violin. I mean, I quite enjoyed playing in the Belfast Youth Orchestra, fighting our way through Dvorak's 8th Symphony. But to get to the point where I could enjoy that, I had to spend hours practicing scales and arpeggios. And there wasn't a lot of fun in that. But education isn't always inspirational and attractive. Some basic knowledge and skills have to be built into the pupil. So in church, the same principle applies. We need, I think, a revolution on how we think about church, because it's a place where we learn stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really key principle, a basic principle that we need to have in our heads. But how should we encounter the 5 specific challenges you identified earlier?
Well, the first thing that we have to do is construct a biblical worldview in the minds of church members. Now, you probably think I'm about to launch into a call for an apologetics program, but I don't think this goal is met through apologetics, really. I think it's absorbed by studying the narrative sections of Scripture, provided they're taught intelligently. So I think churches should be unafraid to tackle the big narratives of the Old Testament. But that brings me to the problem that I called self-centered learning a few minutes ago, the Adolf Hitler, My Part in His Downfall approach to learning. How many times do we enter a passage of the Bible Perhaps God is talking to his friend Moses about the problem of idolatry. And we crash into that passage and say, stop everyone. Can you please make this conversation about me? I'm heading out to work in a few minutes. I need something to give me a bit of spiritual fuel. What promise can I claim here? Now, that sort of Bible study isn't really learning. It's actually a little bit narcissistic when you think about it. We need to have the humility to listen while God talks to his friend Moses about stuff that they find both important and interesting, even if we don't. Because as we do listen, as we absorb the narrative, in a way that's too subtle for us to understand, it begins to form within us a biblical way of thinking.
That humility is also the answer to the problem of rebelling against authority, isn't it? We need the humility to sit under the authority of Scripture, not demand it be changed to align with our lived experience.
Exactly. Now, the approach only works if Bible teachers draw out the really big questions that underpin the narrative, the questions about value and purpose and significance. I mean, I don't mean to be irreverent here, but if the Old Testament reduces to 1,000,001 pictures of Christ, then all you're left with is typology. The Old Testament defines the problem space that Christ then resolves. So it raises the big questions of life that allow us to see the depth of Christ's work.
How should parents handle this incredibly difficult problem of indoctrination of infants?
Yeah, I remember giving a seminar up at New Horizons. I must have been about 4 years ago. And a young mother asked me that question, and it completely floored me. And I still don't really have an answer because there are no resources available to parents, or at least they're maybe just beginning to emerge, which counter the ghastly indoctrination their infant children are starting to receive in school. There's a desperate need for high-quality apologetic material for 4-year-olds. We need simple stories that explain concepts like truth and human value and right and wrong and so on. Now, that is by far the hardest form of apologetic material to write, and Christian parents need it urgently. Yeah,
just to jump in at that point, Jim, kind of in preparation for this episode, I was doing a little bit of research into some resources that potentially could help out in that sphere, and there are now some that are becoming available, some really good quality resources as well. So what I'll do at the end of this recording is I'll link some of those resources on our website, because as you say, it's absolutely critical that young parents or parents are equipped with these resources to help with this problem.
Yes, I think the reason it's so important is, I've talked to parents of young children, and their deepest instinct, as you can understand, is just to isolate their children from it, to protect them, to put them in a bubble. But given what's going on in schools now, in infant schools, that strategy no longer works. Anyway, the general point in this whole conversation, Ollie, is that the Christian home and the church should become education centres that counter the lies and which complement the deficiencies that exist within the state education system. So we need to have a fundamental rethink of our role. And hopefully this conversation might trigger much better and more helpful conversations among our listeners.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks so much for all your hard work this season. I realize you've put a lot of hours into researching these topics and prayerfully considering them. We've explored so many topics, as I outlined at the beginning, that directly impact our lives as 21st century Christians. And I'm sure you're looking forward to a break from podcasting for a few months before we return again for season 4. To our listeners, thank you for sticking with us. Many of you have stuck with us right from season 1 back in 2019. Your support and encouragement have been so appreciated. If you'd like to suggest topics or questions for season 4, please do get in touch with us via social media or send us an email to theequipproject@gmail.com. In the meantime, please do continue to share these podcasts with friends and family. We've now published over 60 episodes, so there's something there for just about everyone. And please continue to pray for the Lord's blessing on this work. We're so grateful for all that He has done through the Equip Project to date. That's all from us for now. We hope you have a wonderful summer.